Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron.
Today, we wanted to talk about something we've sort of hinted at it, right, or discussed it in like a few different contexts, but never like explicitly. And that is how we like to use seeders in our Laravel application. Like, what purpose do they serve? Because people use them for different things, but we sort of have a way of approaching it. And thought it'd be nice to kind of lay out here what our approach is and why.
Yeah, you mean like database seeders, not those things that stop moths in your closet, cedar strips or whatever.
Oh boy, we're already starting with the tree puns. Okay, yes, database seeders, the thing that lets you generate data by running a command.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things we want to clear up first before we get in there.
Mm-hmm.
So seeders are like Joel said, running a command to generate data. That doesn't mean that there isn't other commands that can do that sort of stuff too. It's just this is
Sure.
a sort of like set aside sort of, if you're looking in the database / seeders folder, you're going to find commands that are written or that are ran by the seeder command structure of Laravel that will
Mm-hmm.
generate data.
Right.
And they may use just direct SQL, they may use eloquent models, they may use eloquent factories, they
Mm-hmm.
can use any number of things. That's not necessarily the aim of what we want to talk about today.
Right.
We
Right.
want to talk more about like why what they're for and why you might use them.
Yeah, and so let me just kind of start with a concrete example, right? Because I think this is pretty universal for Laravel applications. You have a users table, right? And you
Mhm.
log in as a user. So would we put users, like you need a user to use the application? Would we put those in a seeder, Aaron? What would you do?
Well, do you need a user to use the application? First of all, is the question.
Hmm.
Um, in this case, I'm going to say, let's just say we're talking about like a one super admin user that gets created when the
Hmm.
application first goes out or
Right.
to a new environment or something like that. I would still, and this might be controversial, but I would still put that in my migration.
Okay.
And the reason we do that is because we kind of talk about migrations are setting up the structure of your database,
Hmm.
as well as, in my opinion, anything that's absolutely 1,000% required for your application to succeed. And we might have mentioned this
Right.
before, like for example, zip codes. Um, Having all the zip codes in your database makes it work, the application will work, but it doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily. It's not required for the system to run. And we're just talking about the very basics of running, right?
Right.
So if you don't have a zip code table, well, your code that tries to query the zip code is going to fail. Okay, so that's why the table creation goes into migration.
Yeah.
But if you don't have any zip codes whatsoever, the workflow of your product might fail. Like the user can't get any further along because you can't find their
Hmm.
zip code. But it doesn't mean that the application is doing an error 500. It should be coded in such a way that says,
Right.
I can't find a zip code. This
Yes.
isn't valid. Now, that's not really accurate because there are no zip codes. But there's a slight difference there between the application can work, but just not as expected versus the
Right.
application fails with an error 500.
Right. And I think that is an important distinction because that distinction made it click in my head, right? So same thing with a user, right? If there's no users in the table, nobody can log in, but it's not going to throw an error. It's not going to throw that 500 server exception
Mhm.
error. So I'll admit, like our thinking on this has matured. I was looking at a project that it's not super old, maybe 4 years old. And because I was analyzing like how have we used seeders in our applications, I was doing some research on something. And this one we did actually seed, I think a couple of users, maybe one for us and one for the client. And none of our newer projects do that. But so like we've done this approach in the past. Um, it served a purpose, but we just have a different approach now and kind of settled on this as something we prefer to do. I think it's also important to maybe shift gears a little bit or take a step back, is to like define what is the actual purpose of a seeder. Because you mentioned one that I think most people wouldn't necessarily think about, which is like running it in production to set up a new production environment. That is one way that you would use it. Others I think of maybe more commonly is like, well, I'm a developer using the app locally. I just want to have like a thing I can click around and have some realistic looking data. without having to pull down a production copy of data or something like that. So that's another use case.
Yeah, no one does that anyway, right? They don't pull down production databases and put them in their local
Oh,
stuff.
of course not. Never. That would never happen. And then the third one I think is like for testing, right? So some people like to have certain things ready to go to make writing tests easier or less verbose or whatever. So maybe we should kind of clarify when we're talking about how we use them, like how do we use them in those different formats?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So really what you're kind of saying is like there's a tool set called the Cedar, the Cedar ecosystem almost, and then we can use those for individual things.
Yeah.
Now it's important to understand like one of the core little features that's helpful in Laravel is if you're like doing like a migration fresh, for example, or whatever, and you can go dash seed,
Hmm.
or you can go db:/seed. If you don't specify what Cedar you're aiming for specifically, it'll just run the main Cedar, and in
Yep.
there you could call different Cedars. And so one of the things that we'll do is, first of all, we'll hardly ever put any code or any data inside of the main Cedar.
Right.
We'll do that. Inside of there, we'll check for the triggers that indicate what we're using our Cedars for.
Hmm.
So, for example, if we're running, we might have a check to see if it's the local environment.
Right.
If that's the case, we might then have it call a dev data Cedar. If it's in test, the testing environment, we might, if we're going to do that. I normally don't ever use
Right.
Cedars in testing,
Right.
but
Right.
if you have a really, really, really tough situation, and we're not talking about like making like 2 or 3 models, use a
Hmm.
factory, then just do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But if we're talking like your application for some reason needs 500 whatever
Hmm.
to function in even test, then you might use that. But that way, that the first thing to remember about that then is if you run seed, we're making sure that we only run the proper Cedars for the proper situation. So like even
Yeah.
in production, if we ran it, none of the conditions are true. So no seeding will happen. So
Yes.
that way we don't overwrite any of the data that's already there if we were to happen to accidentally run it in production again.
Right. That would not be good. But yeah, so like relying on those flags or even like what environment is this application running in allows that top level, I think it's just called database seeder, to
Mhm.
decide which seeders are appropriate to run. Because you generally have one seeder per table. It sort of follows the same flow as the factories, right? It's kind of a one-to-one relationship. Doesn't have to be, but that seems to be a convention we follow and that we see used in most Laravel projects.
Yeah. So I think when I take on a project, then my first sort of goal is I want to make sure I can use the project locally for development. And in order to do that, it's kind of like what you mentioned, which is the data that you want. So you can click something around. So
Hmm.
I'll make that dev data Cedar first because for a number of different reasons. One, sometimes the database structure you have is non-existent, or you have to run the migrations a couple of times over and over, or and it's nice to be able to put that data in afterwards. I mean, one of the things that I'll do, we kind of talked about in a different podcast, like migration up and down.
Right. Yeah.
But in other cases, if you have your local stuff there and you're seeding in your data and all that kind of stuff anyway, and you want to start over from fresh, let's just say you've clicked around and done a bunch of stuff, you could do migrate fresh : seed, or migrate fresh dash dash seed, blow away all your data, rebuild the database, and seed in all your data structure to begin with again. So
Yeah.
you're all at the position that you recognize and you can start again. So sometimes you want to keep your development data, sometimes you want to blow it away. And so
Hmm.
having that data structured in that development Cedar is usually the first place I go because I really don't want to be downloading that production data.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure. There's all sorts of concerns, data privacy, security, things like that we're not going to get into today. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is important to consider. So, like, if I had to kind of summarize our approach, you can tell me if you disagree. But like the seeders meant for production, extremely minimal, and in fact, I will say almost always nothing. Like no
Mhm.
seeders intended to run in production. Seeders used for testing, same thing. Almost never use them. We prefer to have the tests explicitly set up the data they need. But then that dev data seeder, like the just to facilitate me clicking around the app, seeing a UI with a reasonable amount of data, that's where we focus the bulk of our seeding logic and most of the records get generated.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I want to expand one more real quick, the
Okay.
testing.
Mhm.
There's 2 different forms of testing that Cedars probably are important for. The first is, unit or feature testing. So we talk about creating database information to run
Yep.
our tests against. And we're really a fan of just creating that on the, in each test, keeping your
Hmm.
database empty and just, laser focusing on the things that you need. But the other one is load testing.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of times what people don't understand is what is my application going to function like with 100,000 or a million records versus the 10 or 20, maybe even 1,000 that are in there in production right
Right.
now. You can release software and then, as it starts to grow, be like, why is everything slowing down?
Hmm.
Well, there's a way to find out if that's going to happen, and that's load testing. And that's a whole different topic. But one of the things in there is you need to be able to set up database structures maybe in the future, or database amounts that are in the future. So let's just say business says we're going to grow by 10%.
Yeah.
You know that that's not always accurate, but let's just bump that up to 30%.
Hmm.
And so in 1 year from now, we increase our load by, let's just say, even 50%. So we have, 1,000 users in there right now. Let's even bump it up to 10,000.
Sure.
Let's get some good growth here. And you can use seeders then to generate all the data and structures and everything you need for an application that
Yes.
is really in use. And then you can run your load testing against that.
Yeah. Right. And those load testing seeders, let's say you're generating a million rows, like you clearly don't want that in your dev data seeder because it's going to
No.
take time to run. So yeah, that you
Right.
can have a separate one entirely that's just special case for this one particular use, but it's a lot nicer than like, because I mean, how else would you do it, right? You might go into MySQL and generate a bunch of stuff, but like, why not
Right.
leverage everything that Laravel gives you in factories and like relationships and all of that, and just build out a load testing seeder. That's a good use case. I'm glad you brought that up.
Now, I'm not sure if this is like this at all locations for places like McDonald's.
Yeah.
Um, in smaller cities, probably not, or whatever. In larger ones where I live, definitely everyone has this setup.
Okay.
And that setup is the 2 lanes into one
Oh,
drive-through system.
it's just
Now,
inviting chaos. Yeah, I don't like
oh,
it.
I oh man, there's nothing worse than, I mean, there's a lot of things worse. There's nothing worse than the terror of being in one of those 2 lanes, placing
Hmm.
your order, seeing the other person's place their order, and then you both are supposed to go merge into one,
Yeah.
and there's like a car in front, and so you both kind of go forward, and then you're like, which one of us is closer, and who's
Oh
gonna
man.
win? And then
Yeah.
the other person won't stop creeping forward, and like, here's the thing: if someone is in front of you, let them go. Don't keep creeping. Because, like, in my head, all I'm thinking is every time I move forward, you creep forward, you're just going to hit me pretty soon. Like, what are
Well,
you doing?
let me throw an alternate perspective because sometimes I'm the creeper, right? I don't know if that came across wrong, but
Yeah, I believe
um,
that.
no, like if it's busy, there's also somebody behind you that if they could just pull up like one more foot, they could start placing their order, right? And so sometimes the creeping isn't to edge in and like take the next spot, but to like to let the person behind me make their order. Have you thought
Oh,
about that?
no, I have, and you're wrong.
Look,
Um, that's not going to make any difference.
no, it's not. It might even make it worse because you're just bunching up further now.
Yeah, I think that well, I mean, so for those who haven't ever experienced this,
Yeah.
we should probably explain this real quick. There is 2 different kiosks. So when you go up
Mhm.
to the drive-through lane, you can split left or right, and you can order at both of them. And usually it's the same person, just like shifting back and forth
Yeah.
between which one.
Right.
And then they take your order, and then you're supposed to merge, and then I think they track like what color car and like black SUV or white car or something like
Or they
that.
ask your
So
name
that,
sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, at the fancy places where Joe goes, but I'm talking about McDonald's.
The maitre d is out
Um,
there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so when you go through, but there's just like this, like, I don't want to let them get it ahead of me, even though like it doesn't really matter. But
No.
I'm not that competitive. But when we get in that line,
Oh yeah.
oh, don't you dare try to go in front of me if I ordered first. Or when you're
Yeah.
even pulling up and there's like 2 inside and 1 on the other side, and you're
Hmm.
like, I should probably go to the one on the one side, but you never know because maybe that one just got through and so the
Right.
other one is just finishing, and
There's all these calculations that happen. Yes.
Load testing is awesome, but before you get to that, maybe you should just take a quick look through your application and make sure it's ready.
That's something we can help with. If you'd like to learn more, head over to nocompromises.io and see how we can work together.